Hello, listeners. I'm Joey Malbon with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This episode of Below the Radar is a special live recording from SFU School for the Contemporary Arts' 2023 Re-Orientation Day, an all-day event designed to welcome SCA students, faculty, and staff back to campus for the fall semester. The 2023 theme was on place, and the Vancity Office of Community Engagement convened a panel of speakers across the arts, academia, and community engagement to speak on community-engaged practices in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. Our host, Am Johal, is joined by Wendy Pedersen of the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative, SFU Professor of Geography Nick Blomley, musician and facilitator Khari Wendell McLelland, dancer, choreographer, and now SCA faculty Justine Chambers, and Vancity Office of Community Engagement staff Julia Aoki, Kathy Feng, and Samantha Walters. Enjoy the episode.
Before we begin, there's a special notice from Elspeth Pratt, the director of the school, that if you do have classes after 5 p.m. tonight, they are indeed going ahead. Classes are not canceled this evening. Hi, everyone. My name is Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Look forward to the discussion today. It's a live podcast recording for Below the Radar, which is a podcast we run out of our office. Once again, wanted to recognize that we're on the unceded and the stolen territories from the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My parents come from what is today Pakistan. My parents' families moved to India during the partition and that colonial partition, and later immigrated to Canada. I grew up in Williams Lake in rural BC, Shwetma territory. And I think it's really important to think through all the entangled histories of colonialisms, past and present, and how we think and embark and do that work. I'm really excited to have a wonderful group of people that are working at the intersection of art, community, and solidarity in different types of ways. It's people either I work alongside right now or have in the past and hope to continue to do. It's been a wonderful morning, and just wanted to thank all of the organizers of this as well, the opening words from James and the welcome from Cease. Wonderful to hear Stan Douglas talk about work that's really around this neighborhood. I think about 100 West Hastings project all the time, walking to work, and the conversation with Nadia, with Henry, Siku, and Carmel, and the anti-Asiatic riots. Henry's going to be doing a public event here in the cinema in a couple of weeks. I'm just going to maybe begin with, rather than talking about people's bios and things like that, to have people introduce themselves in their own words, and maybe just some opening remarks around how you think about community art or solidarity or anything else you'd like to say. I'll start with Wendy Pedersen.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here and nice to be with this great panel, and thanks for your acknowledgement of the territory and opening Am. So, I've been living and working in the neighborhood my entire adult life, and fell in love the first day I walked into the Carnegie Center to volunteer back in 1991. Met my best friends, who are still best friends now today, and really love this community. And had children here, and live in a co-op here, and didn't know what community organizing was. Didn't have those words for any of that, but ended up just kind of slipping into it gradually. Started as a volunteer, and volunteering is so important. Like when my kids are sad, I tell them, go volunteer, you guys. It really fills your soul and really helps you connect with people and learn about where you are. And so initial remarks, that's my initial remarks on community. And also just to think about what the difference between, and learn about what the difference is as students and art students, the difference between what's an activist, what's an advocate, what's an organizer. I think those are things that sometimes students don't realize there's differences. And to learn about that as you're, getting involved in the community and seeing what other people are doing.
Khari.
Thank you. I always just become curious when you're around. I'm so delighted by your presence and the work that you do in community, and I always just feel like I want to lean a little bit more this way.
Thanks, Khari.
My name's Khari Wendell McLelland. I just want to first say it's so nice to see all of your faces, and I also become very curious about all of you and your stories and your lineages, and think about the impossibility of this meeting happening at any other time, and especially if we think about that generationally. Our grandmother's in the same room, highly unlikely. So I find lots of hope and possibility inside of that knowing, and lots of work simultaneously. I am a musician, a theater artist, an author, a facilitator, contract facilitator, and an instructor here at SFU, instructing in public engagement, facilitation, and community capacity building. And yeah, when I think about, I always think about informality and the non-elevated forms of connection that are often happening in neighborhoods and in communities. And I think about my grandmother in Detroit. I was raised in the loving embrace of two Black women as I was growing up in the United States. And the work of community building that my grandmother and all of her cohort of elder Black women, many of them from the South who had made the Great Migration, the way that they cared for each other, the way that they cared for each other's children and grandchildren. No one ever went hungry. It was an incredible amount of poverty in that community, in that neighborhood, but there was so much richness inside of those relationships. And so when I think about my desire to feed my neighbors through my efforts in my garden, I always think about my grandmother's hands, and my hands look a lot like her hands. And so, those are the things that I think about. What it means to be truly a good neighbor is a concern that I take up inside my own heart on a regular basis.
Thanks, Khari. Justine?
That's all true about Khari. I know him. My name's Justine Chambers. I'm a mother. I'm a dancer. I'm a choreographer. I'm a second-year MFA student at the School for Contemporary Arts, and I'm an instructor, and I love fashion. And I'm nervous. And I think what I like to think about, I'm going to be brief, when I think about community like Khari, I was raised by Black women. My family was part of the Great Migration from the South to Chicago. People who didn't have a lot of monetary means, but did have means of care and hope. And when I think about community, I always think about, or for me, it's about attending to the space between people that I know and people that I don't know. So I guess that's what I bring in my practice, perhaps, or I hope to. But I think about community as being work from person to person. I've lived on the Downtown Eastside for 10 years. I just moved into the Four Sisters Co-op, I'm delighted to say. I have a 2-bedroom apartment, oh my goodness. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Sam, for this invitation.
Thanks, Justine.
Nick, it's hard to follow this wonderful group, but I'm just honored to be here with you all and you all here. These panels are kind of weird because I feel like we should be in a huge circle because everyone has stories that we should be sharing. That would be rather challenging in this space. My name is Nick Blomley. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, so I'm supposed to know something about place, which I guess is a theme we're going to be talking about, which puts me on the kind of spot a little bit, because I think place is much more capacious than something confined to a discipline or a geography or a department. It's something that's lived and practiced and performed and embedded and entangled with community in good ways and in bad ways. It can be a double-edged sword. It can be a weapon by means of through which community is destroyed. It can also be a space of love, a space of freedom, as Ruthie Gilmore puts it. Freedom is a place. I was not born here. I was born in rural England in a very small village. And a village that was actually marked by conflicts over land, long histories of struggles over land and the dispossession of poor people through a process called enclosure, where the commons was destroyed and rich people took the land and displaced poor people. And then I ended up in Vancouver, and it turned out that the same thing was happening and continues to happen in this place. It's called something different. It's called urban development or urban improvement. But I rocked up in the Downtown Eastside. I met Wendy and others way back then and was surprised by the continuities. And then to learn also, of course, about the Indigenous relation to land, which added another layer, an important layer, which I think is vital to our understanding. And thinking that through in any conversation around community and place to me is fundamentally important. So
Thanks. Nick, Julia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Aoki. If I were to summarize myself and my place on this panel, I think it's in part that I've had some success in combining my interest in community-engaged work and programming with the need for gainful employment. And I've managed to find myself in a number of different institutions that have allowed me to do that, including here. I'm a program manager in the Vancity Office of Community Engagement. I was not long ago the executive director of Megaphone Magazine, which is a social service / cultural organization serving folks in the Downtown Eastside mainly. I was the general manager of Vivo Media Arts Center for a number of years. And then all yada, yada, yada through the PhD that I didn't finish. But going a little bit further back from that, I was the general manager and programming coordinator of the Powell Street Festival briefly, and I held a number of positions with that organization prior to that. And that is the space, that is the place, that's the kind of experience that I think of immediately when you pose the question, the prompt. And I think that's in part because it was so formative for me. I attended the Powell Street Festival from a very, very young age with very little awareness of its historical relevance. I just wanted to be there there used to be a game where you could scoop up goldfish with a paper net, and you had to get the goldfish before the net broke. And so that was something that I really loved, and of course the food. But, with age, I became more kind of aware of the history of the Powell Street Festival, which I could speak to more if there's a relevant conversation around that. But I think in part what it is that it became a kind of a site for, it's not immediate or overt political organizing. It's a space of gathering, it's a space of shared experience. But I realized that in part, through the way that organization operates, in part because of the history of the Powell Street Festival, it is by its very nature a very politicized entity. And the people that do the work inside the organization have taken that up quite seriously. And, to this day, it's almost 50 years old, there are people involved with the Powell Street Festival. I mean, Kathy Shimizu, who would hate to have her name brought, she doesn't like much attention, but this amazing human being who is doing incredible advocacy work and is, people in the Downtown Eastside know her. They know her work. I know her because when I first started with the Powell Street Festival, she was the person that on setup day would just tell you where every single thing went. And she would direct like hundreds of volunteers and the whole thing would go up in an afternoon. It was just amazing. So yeah, people that are doing, and she led a food program out of We Press, or kind of an extension of We Press during the pandemic. It continues to this day. And I think for her and for a lot of others, it is that kind of intersection between the history of the festival and what it means to be in this neighborhood and the current existing community. So,
Thanks, Julia. Kathy.
Hello, I'm Kathy. I also work with Am and Julia and Sam at the Vancity Office of Community Engagement. I'm very honored to be sitting here alongside such wonderful people doing such wonderful work, and I feel very green because I feel like a child. But I'm also an immigrant. I was born in China and grew up here in Vancouver, so I'm constantly learning about the place, learning about the relationships and how to navigate this space. I am an SFU alum of the Visual Arts Department. I very recently graduated, and and a lot of my work and my way of seeing the world has been informed by what I learned through school, and also going to school right here in this building between the 611 studios at Alexander. And I feel very grateful to be here.
Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam, or Samantha Walters, my business name, but I'm the program assistant here at the office with Julia and Kathy. I'm also an alumni of the theatre performance program here, still doing the theatre thing outside of work here. Mostly trying to do a lot of ensemble devised kind of projects and projects that engage with people who are coming to see it. I'm not really interested in works that don't directly engage with an audience anymore. Like this kind of setup where people are sitting in the audience is kind of my nightmare now. But I think so many great things have been said already about community and art. And I moved to Vancouver 5 years ago. I was born in England and then lived most of my life in Hong Kong and then moved here. And so I'm still learning a lot about just this place in general and what the politics and intense interconnected relationships are, and what my place is here as well with a sort of colonial ancestry. And I think what was really a big shift in my mindset when I was a student here was not leaning into the very easy to lean into rhetoric of being like scared of being in the Downtown Eastside and being worried about what's going on, which I think a lot of Vancouver media kind of tries to promote for developer interests. And just that it's not that. Like there's lovely people everywhere here and it's not dangerous, and it's like art comes out of this neighborhood, and to really listen to folks who are making that art and to not insert yourself too forcefully into those narratives, but to listen to the peers who are doing that work. That's what I think I have right now.
Thanks. There's clearly the intense spatial politics of being here, and part of walking in here as a student, regardless of what discipline you're coming into, you walk into a set of conversations, and it's not immediately clear as to how to take up these questions. Sometimes they'll come up pedagogically in the classes you're taking. Other times it's part of coming to and from the space. But I think what makes this art school in particular special is that it is located here, and it's an opportunity to be in a longer term conversation in terms of the types of questions that arise. And I think to do this in a generous, generative way, a number of you have probably moved from outside of Vancouver. It's probably your first couple of weeks being here. And to try to make this a conversation that you have a lot of doors to walk into, and to keep thinking it through as you move through the school. The question I wanted to throw out, and anyone can jump in, is just sort of around the role of art in terms of community organizing, in terms of politics. There's great histories of the Heart of the City Festival and others, but maybe I'll start with Justine and Khari with your artistic practices of how you think about living in this place and making work in your particular disciplines, how it shapes you or how you're informed by it.
I'll go. For a great deal of time, I've been thinking about, it's nothing new. It's been going on for a long time, but, the social choreographies. I look at Alana Garricky, who I've done work with Am and Alana, looking at just the movement of the city or how the city moves you, how the city would like you to move, how the city doesn't want you to move, and the choices we can make with and against that as acts of insistence, perhaps more than doesn't always have to be resistant. And in this neighborhood, what can I say? I've been able to witness and learn about how bodies moving collectively can allow us to imagine things otherwise. And with Alana and with my partner Josh Haidt, I've worked on making choreography walks where we really just take the time to see the choreography of the city, how it moves itself, how we would like to move it, and how how when we do something else with it allows us to see the city differently, or the people in the city differently. So I feel like that started to emerge after I was living here, and I'm saying this with 2020 hindsight, realizing, So in that way, I'm also I'm always wondering about sort of these choreographies of sociality, like how, like you were saying, Sam, like you can put a narrative on this neighborhood or you can project your fears upon this neighborhood. But in fact, the neighborhood can teach you ways of relating that allow you to maybe understand people differently. And I think that shows up in my practice, whether I'm doing something on a stage or in a gallery or in the streets of this neighborhood. And in barely preparing for this podcast, it's the first week of school. My kids started at a new school. I was reminded of when Max was 3, that's my son, and one of the most remarkable choreographies I've seen in the city, which really started to make me think about how empathy works at a distance, was I'm walking back from Costco. You know how that goes. You're shattered after you leave Costco. Walking back, shadow of myself, with a 3-year-old who's physically wild. And we're walking along Carroll Street towards Hastings, and he takes off. And I'm like, toilet paper, And I'm like, Max, using my theater voice to scream, Max. And 4 women who were sitting on the street in their own lives in that moment heard me, saw me, and stood up and made a 4-person wall so that my child couldn't go into traffic. And I was like, and I said to myself, that wouldn't happen anywhere but here. Because when you need community, you enact community. And perhaps in other places in the city, you don't need community the same way because you have walls and cars and you can order Amazon right to your door. And I can do that too. Well, I can, but I do think that was sort of something that really enacted this idea of how social choreography or how choreography can be an empathic act. It can be the work of empathy. That's how I'm going to answer your prompt.
Thank you. Khari?
Wow, there's so much there. Yeah, this neighborhood has really changed me in profound ways in terms of like where my focus is and like what I'm choosing to create as an artist. I think that Wade Compton, who's a brilliant historian and writer and thinker and artist, he says this. He said, "There are no heroes," And he was talking about complicating narratives. And like how I understand that is that like there are very simple renderings and stories that all of us are given from the time, we're very small children about who people are and what they look like and where they live and how they live and the stories behind how they end up wherever they are. And this community has complicated all of those renderings in a really beautiful way, in a way that isn't always easy to be with, because it takes away the notion of like a perfect ideal in some ways and makes us be with what we really are. As a neighborhood, as a community, as a city, as a society. And so I find that my work is really often trying to actually complicate simple narratives, not in a way to overcomplicate a thing, but to actually make something that feels, I paints the picture round is the phrase that I often use. I want something that actually feels real. And this neighborhood has really inspired my work to move in that direction, to try to create work that reflects something that's real and that paints the picture round, and that gives voice to the scenius as opposed to genius of communities. And how they survive and the beauty that they create. And I do want to just mention again the Heart of the City Festival, because the work of Terry and Savannah, it's often like 80 to 100 events. For one festival, it's bonkers. But it's also the thing that I think gave me my first true introduction to the neighborhood in some ways. And it was through the voices and the bodies of people who were living in the community, who often are unheard. And so I really think if you are curious about learning more about the neighborhood and through the arts, I think the Heart of the City Festival is such a beautiful and important way to understand that. And to understand that it's... It is a life's work. I don't know. It's hard to say that because it's comprised of so many lives, but it feels like it's generational and it's of this neighborhood, and it's really powerful.
Thanks, Khari. Wendy, of course, you know the folks at the Heart of the City Festival. Karen Jameson's been doing great work. She's a former student of SFU who trained as a professional dancer, but also has been leading a troupe out of the Carnegie Center. They also do some rehearsals here in the building. But wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of how arts are the way that you, in terms of community organizing, it's one of the gentlest way of bringing people together is through the arts to also raise other issues, right?
Yeah, I think my first experience with the Woodwards building was painting a daisy on the side. We were told just to go from Carnegie. They just schlepped us out the door. Go down to Woodwards and help paint. We're like, okay. And then we realized what was going on, that it was this building was a intersection of conflict. It was a hot spot of community organizing and community dreams and community dashed dreams. And people could see at the Carnegie Center, when I was in my 20s, I'm now in my 50s, the 50-year-olds could see the gentrification was coming, and they knew the Olympics were coming, and they knew Woodwards were coming. So they were starting to gather resources, money, to hire a community organizer who could help stop gentrification. How do you do that? And so this building has such a history, and it means so much. Like I wouldn't come, actually, I was on the Woodwards Advisory Committee. After I kind of got roped in and tricked onto it in some complicated way. I could tell a longer story about sometime. But I remember not knowing the word gentrification and us struggling to tell the people on the committee what was going on, and them just outmaneuvering us in the community so easily. But they wanted a mom who was involved in social enterprise like myself on the committee. So yeah, and we really got duped into making some concessions that we shouldn't have had to make. But art, it continues on, and here I am, and I go shop at Nestor's, and I'm part of the, this has become part of the community, but it has so much rich history. And we've also used arts. We had the Poverty Olympics, and it was just art on top of art on top of art. It was so much fun. So many skits, like jumping over the welfare hurdles, and even my kids, my 5-year-old and my partner and the boy next door, Joey, Ann Livingston's son, they did a little skit wrestling for the community. So the little kids had community on their back and Downtown Eastside on their back, and then the developer had his horns and his suit, and he did pile drives, and then the kids ganged up and took him down, and the whole audience of about 500 people just went crazy. So arts is really central, and we always did little capers, to get media attention about what things were going on, and we always tried to have an arts element, and there's a lot of community-based artists who are amazing in the Downtown Eastside that you could get to know. Right now at the SRO Collaborative, the group that I'm the executive director, we don't do too much arts-based organizing. Our community organizing is all about getting tenants together to take on more control in their buildings and take on initiatives that help them. I have this theory that whatever they touch, they own. And so they get involved helping each other in their buildings, and they're starting to learn. We're learning about governance and Indigenous governance, and we have a community land trust, and we're trying to, take some land out of the market and into community hands and figure out what community governance is. So I'm not really too involved in the arts, but arts is definitely hard to separate out. It's part of the fabric of the Downtown Eastside and the community organizing for sure.
Julia, you want to share something? You had obviously lots of work that you programmed at the Powell Street Festival, but also Vivo.
A couple things. Moving back to Ann Livingston, who folks might not know, was well known as the founder of the Vancouver area network of drug users, but also quite a few other peer drug user groups throughout the province. And I was actually listening to her interview, an old Below the Radar interview with her, and she, she's, from what I know, an organizer, right? Like, she's an organizer, but she spoke at one point about the need for people like, specifically, she mentions Bud Osborne, and the people in the community, the artists who could relate in a sort of different way, because when you speak about, homelessness or the toxic drug supply crisis or what have you, there are very obvious and logical solutions. And unfortunately, it's sort of a fallacy that people operate at the level of pure logic, right? Like, there's very obvious solutions, and they're just not being deployed. So someone like Bud Osborne was drawing people into the work, into the movement in a different way. And I thought that was a very beautiful kind of mention in that. For myself and other spaces, what has been really important, say at Megaphone, which is a street paper that is used as a form of low barrier peer employment in the community. So you'll see Megaphone vendors throughout the city selling the magazine. And while I was there, increasingly wanted more kind of peer involvement and content within the magazine itself. And it's just, quite plain, I think. It's quite obvious why that's important. And often, people would come in, with a poem, and they would want that in the magazine. And that sort of was the mode of expression for a lot of people, was like, I have this piece of writing that I want to put out into the world. And it didn't have to be about their, most kind of horrific experiences. Like, but that's not what we were asking. Sometimes it was just, a reflection on a tree, or, I don't know. I was described as an eagle in one poem that I kept that I thought was really nice. I don't know why. I don't relate to eagles. Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's incredibly important means of organizing and expressing and relating on a human level. And again, just beyond the most cold kind of rationale.
Kathy, Sam, as recent graduates of the school, how are you thinking through some of this work, or whether it's the neighborhood or community solidarity, or how it comes up in your own practices?
Well, I think a lot about, I think my feeling for myself as an artist is that it's really important to have an activist practice that is not solely artistic. Because I think having political art is great, but it can't be your only modes of political expression. Like a project that I was working on recently, it's called Demoviction Tarot. It's sort of a tarot reading based off of Vancouver housing crisis, which involved a lot of research about demoviction and going through like all of the residential tenancy branch forms and making tarot cards based on them. It's a silly little project, but it was really fun because it was really fun to have conversations with a lot of people my age who are experiencing these huge housing crunches and just talking about these things in a sort of silly, lighthearted way that's not so deep and depressing. But also, aside that, knowing that I'm also wanting to show up at these protests, like the recent Kiefer Street development things that you should definitely look into as well, and all of these areas of displacement in the Downtown Eastside. So yeah, what I guess I'm thinking about is like that art can be a really powerful means of learning about these issues and really having discussions and engagement with it. But I always encourage myself to go beyond that at the end of the day as well.
I don't know if I have a solid answer for your question, but I think not even just within the Downtown East Side or any specific community, but I think it is so valuable to be making art in community with people in the city and also your peers. And I think it could be a very lonely process, I guess, if you think about making art or art making in this very individualistic way. And I think that has helped me out a lot, not only within my artistic work, but also in our work with the office, and really just working on building relationships with the people around you, and in that creating opportunities to have creative expression and also support people in a very holistic way, I guess. Yeah.
And Nick, you've got over 30-year history of doing research in and around the neighborhood in various types of ways, and you do community-engaged forms of research, which involves gathering people and working together, but wondering if some arts-based approaches and others have been relevant for your work. But you've certainly been around the neighborhood where you've seen the arts and how that informs your own work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it does, and I want to echo also the point that the Downtown Eastside is a space of creativity and art in all sorts of remarkable ways. And I loved your choreography. I think that's beautiful. I've never thought of that, but I think that's just wonderful too. I'll have to think about the street more differently. And it always has been. Yeah, Bud Osborne was mentioned. I mean, Bud and Anne, they co-created Vandu, and Bud was a street poet. And I just want to put his name in the room because he's for me such an important figure. I know, Wendy, you had a very strong relationship to Bud. Bud passed away 10 years ago.
We're on 2014.
2014. Okay, yeah. So if you don't know Bud, you should find Bud's work. He's a published poet. He also has. I'm teaching a first year introductory human geography class tomorrow, and I'm going to show a video of Bud's called 100 Block. So you can find that online. It's a sort of jazz poetry piece in which he talks about the 100 Block of Hastings Street. And it's poetry that speaks to the pain and the violence of the Downtown Eastside, but also love. I mean, love is just central to his poetry. He also wrote a poem called Raise Shit, a Downtown Eastside. I wrote it down, a little bit of it actually. Raise Shit, a Downtown Eastside poem of resistance. And this is just a few lines. To raise shit for Bud was, quote, to actively resist. And we resist with our presence, with our words, with our love, with our courage. I think recognizing that and honoring that work to me is important, and the ongoing creativity that happens here is also just wonderful, against all odds. Or maybe because of the odds, I don't know. I think it's a combination of both. But in terms of, I did work in the Downtown Eastside as a researcher and also as an ally. And then I stepped away for a long time, mostly because of a feeling that this was a space that has been over-researched. And there are some very unethical forms of extractive research that have happened in the Downtown Eastside and continue to happen in the Downtown Eastside, to be honest. But then I became involved in a project that involved Wendy and the SRO Collaborative called The Right to Remain. And this is a project that has been going on very quietly for about 10 years. Jeff Masuda is the kind of key primum mobile, the driver for this. He now teaches at UVic. He has historical ties to Powell Street. And it's a research project that actually, we joke about it, it's actually the most unsuccessful research project that has ever existed, insofar as it hasn't actually produced very much, quote, research. And that's kind of the point. It's a project that really, in its most recent iteration has taken a different form, but the one that just finished was basically to find ways to support the group of the work of the SRO Collaborative, and to be, if you will, the kind of research arm of the SRO Collaborative. That was the way it was described, and to work with tenants. So tenants became researchers themselves in uncovering the history of the SRO. We don't actually know much about the SRO. There are still 5,000 privately owned SRO units in the Downtown Eastside, and they have these storied histories that needed to be unpacked. And art was central to that. One form has been a film. We're still working on this film. It continues to iterate, and it showed at the Heart of the City 2 years ago. Another form has been haiku, and this connects to the Japanese-Canadian connection with Jeff and other scholars, and using haiku of the poetic form. You all know haiku, right? 5-7-5 syllables. Not syllabus, that's term teaching mode.
Yeah. It's September.
Read the syllable, whatever you do. Sorry. But having tenants, for example, write haiku and to talk about their experiences and to talk about, in some cases, trauma. And in many cases, people were simply willing to just provide a word. And then somebody else has another word. And haiku turns out to be, I didn't know this, collaborative. It's a collective exercise. And it's a very political exercise. So that turned out to be a really, I think, interesting and important means by which we could learn from tenants about their own lives and use haiku as a medium for that.
I'm really glad you all brought up Bud Osborne. He's very dear to me as well. And the another film that Nathaniel Geary did based on a poem of his called Keys to Kingdoms. I think it's from around 1999, a really beautiful work. And the first public event that we organized here was when Insight was in front of the Supreme Court with Pivot, and Bud came and read a couple of poems of his that relate to the opening of Insight, which is just about to have its 20-year anniversary this week. In fact, there's an event happening next week at Hastings Street, but Bud read from it here, and we have it on video as well, and we share it in classes. Earlier, we had already circulated the ethical manifesto for ethical research in the Downtown Eastside, which was produced in the community by residents. We also have the Empowered Informed Consent card that was produced by the same group out of Hives for Humanities after they had a very negative experience with a documentary filmmaker. And as you mentioned, Nick, there's a long history of research in the Downtown Eastside, but also a long history of bad research done badly. Also, a long history of art being produced in the neighborhood, really great art as well, but also problematic art, oftentimes people landing art down in the neighborhood to give it a political edge without having relationships built or doing harms attached to it. And these are some of the questions that come up for us as an art school based where we are, and how to think of it as a productive conversation. There isn't a checklist or a list, but how to make questions about ethics as ongoing ones. And that's something we want to sort of introduce in a generous, generative way, because it's an ongoing set of ways of working. But I'm wondering if any of you would sort of jump in to just talk about how you think about ethics, or examples of ways that people are working both as academics or artists that you think are making good work, but things that come up for you, because I think it's a kind of an ever-present issue about doing work in this context.
Well, the first thing that popped in my head was speak from your own experience, which as a facilitator, somebody who leads groups and uses the arts often in those spaces, I often think that when we speak from the position of our own experience, that we're and connecting to our own lineages and being honest to those people who loved us into existence, that we're much more likely to render something that would be honoring and respectful of yourself, your own experience, and the places that you come from. I understand how exciting it can be to imagine into other people's experiences. And sometimes as a writer, I do that, but I'm often very cautious about that work, and I'm often really trying to make sure that it in some ways is reflective of my own lineages and my own experiences. So that's the first thing that popped into my head.
I might say that I'm often an ethical violation, and so I just want to be honest and don't say that I have any very high wisdom to partake, but you can learn a lot by mistakes. So be open to your mistakes and be present and humble, and really think deeply about what messages you're being given, because sometimes the messages are harsh when they come back at you, but they can actually, can be a gift. Yeah, you can learn a lot, and it can change you. And I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Sam said. It's a little off topic, but if students want to get involved in things that aren't directly related to their art or their research, there's ways to get involved. And one thing that I'm just going to make a plug, Am knows it's coming.
Because you're an organizer, Wendy.
That's why we invited you, Wendy.
That I think the academics and the student movement needs to be more involved in election organizing. And it's not palatable for everybody, because theory is great. I'm an anarchist. I believe in the revolution. But I also think there's a vast difference between what different parties bring at the 3 level of colonial governments. I don't particularly want to work with the colonial governments, but I think if you don't help us, we are so trashed. We are under such siege. It's so bad. It can't get any worse. We keep thinking it can't get worse, and then it gets worse. And a lot of it is the fine line between these policy decisions. So it is an easy way for you to get involved in organizing to make a tangible difference in the Downtown Eastside, to keep your eyes on that and not reject it.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks.
Any of you around, either academics or
Sorry, I took
artists?
you off
working in
ethics.
That's all right. That's all right.
I think for me, and yeah, mistakes are usually the most humiliating way to reorient yourself. But I think, it's like to not make humans material for making is one thing I think about in art practices. Without having a consensual conversation and then a conversation about consent also. And secondly, like being in genuine relation with people. And that doesn't mean it has to be good relation, but you are in genuine relation with people. Yeah, I think that would, and then I guess just something else is that has come up and today is just like the damage narrative is not the only narrative.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's thank you, that's a super important point because it's easy to focus on pain and damage and one mustn't forget that because there is pain everywhere and there's violence everywhere, but if that's not the only story, but it's easy to come in with that, even as a good kind of progressive, I'm here to make things better mode. And there's been far too many people that have come to the Downtown Eastside, I'm sure myself included, who wants to try and make things better and try and improve. And sometimes those are developers. They'll say, I'm here to improve because I'm going to, bring middle-class people. And when we bring middle-class people in, everyone will get better because the boat, the rising tide will lift all boats and all that neoliberal bullshit. But it can also be progressives who say exactly the same thing. What we need is we need X or we need Y. And the one thing I think I'm beginning to learn after spending some time in this place over the past decade is that one first needs to listen before one speaks. And that's actually difficult for me to do, but doing that I think is a vital first step to listen and to respect and to learn from others and to learn the incredible capacity and ingenuity and creativity that's already happening. Like in terms of tenant organizing, tenants are self-organizing, right? And sometimes they need some resources and so on and some supports, but it's the capacity to self-organize that is what makes things possible.
When you asked that, what came to mind was the thought that in the city, the sort of prevailing narrative is that the city is victimized by the Downtown Eastside, and which becomes the justification for things like street sweeps and shutting down vendors for whom vending is a lifeline. That's happening right now. And that's terrible, and that should be challenged at every turn. Something that I do sometimes see, I don't want to discourage anyone from being involved and getting active, but when I was working at Megaphone, the sort of like flip side to that coin that I would get anxious about is this other sort of centering of oneself in the Downtown Eastside through really intense identification with people who live down here and their experiences. And just finding that sort of balance if you're working in community of, really centering the community that you're working with. What you'd said about consent, I think is incredibly important, Justine. So,
Okay, thanks. And Kathy, Sam, as students who walk between this building and 611 Alexander, the way that you thought about this and now and while you're students?
Yeah, I think as students, and I'm speaking a lot for myself, but also I know that this campus is one where a lot of people are probably traveling from through various parts of the city, other cities, even in the suburbs. And I think for a lot of students as well, it is maybe the first time that you're navigating the Downtown Eastside. And it's so easy to look around and see all the injustice and feel very invigorated and inspired, like you want to make work about it, which is, I'm not discouraging that, but I think just to echo what everyone else has already said, it is so important to, first of all, find your voice and where you situate yourself within this community. and build relationships and have conversations and open dialogues from a place of wanting to learn and not wanting to do something with, particularly, because that could become very exploitative. And yeah, just Khari, what you were saying earlier about speaking from what you know, I think is so important. Sometimes your voice doesn't need to be put out there, you know, and you can still make amazing work that centers the community, that comes from a place of honesty and not from wanting to make something out of a community you're not part of. But it is also, you know, wonderful to get involved. And I think the most important thing is just building those relationships and learning and having conversations. I think that dialogue is very important. So.
Yeah, I agree. Like the relationship building is so important. And I was really struck when I was rereading the Research 101 earlier that like so many of the points were just about respect and respecting other people and how it's so seemingly simple. But yeah, it's like, how are you going to make work with the community and about this community when you're not even like making eye contact with people on the street? And like I live in East Van, just like on the edge of the Commercial Drive industrial area. And so when I take the bus in here, on times when I'm feeling really complacent or like bogged down by like the energy of the world, I can feel like I'm in a fishbowl and that like I'm just looking out on this community and that I just watch it go by. But I really encourage myself and others to like break out of that, because that's how we end up with these complacent politicians and complacent policies that don't center community justice and equity. And yeah, just talk to people. I don't know. It's like, listen to people, have conversations about anything. If someone walking down Hastings is asking you how your day's going, talk to them.
And also ask questions from people who have been working in the community for a really long time, like, you know, anybody here, but also any community organizers, and just putting yourself in that place where you're really open to learning.
Something came to me, and it's around imagination, and the link between creativity and imagination, and how we often think of the arts as like a very particular category of thing. Oh, you're a painter, you're an artist, you're a creative person. But I really believe that like people who are resilient and surviving in the Downtown Eastside, they're creative as AF. You know, all of you, you know, and I feel like so many of the problems that we are experiencing in our larger world really are just, they're problems of imagination. We have seen a thing go the way it's gone for you know, a number of years. We've heard the stories that that's how things have gone. And we just kind of believe that. But I actually believe people whose work it is to be creative, like so many of you in this room, that your role in this world is pivotal. And I'll give you one example very quickly about why that is. I polled a group of political organizers, and I asked them, how many of you have had the experience of doing musical theater or music? And 75% of them raised their hands. Now, I think there is a very strong correlation because these people practiced creativity throughout their lives and that they're drawn to trying to create solutions, challenges to what has gone before. And so I see all of you in that same light. I see your role as cultivating your own creativity, even if it is in the arts, that it has this potential to really move out into the world in ways that could really change what's happening. So I see you as pivotal and important.
Nice. Nice. I was going to say also, you know, there's the relationship between community and academy is so problematic in so many ways, and we try and create these spaces, but the systems, the processes can be totally problematic. And so in as much as the academy has its forms of rigor, or artistic disciplines have their forms of rigor, the community has its own ways of adjudicating rigor. And if people cut corners, particularly around relationship building, respect, the work will be called out in particular ways. So if you're intending to make rigorous work, it invites you to ask those difficult questions moving through the work. Thank you so much for kicking us off here. And I'm going to actually open it up to questions right now. And as you, please do introduce yourself when you're asking a question. If it's directed to someone in particular, please do say that as well. There's one up there.
Thank you. Oh, okay. I'm not sure who asked the question, but at the very beginning of the podcast, someone talked about how kind of like the space by Hastings kind of like enforces like choreography in a sense. And I think it was like a dancer. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Justine.
Justine. And I was just wondering if you could like talk about how you think the area and the space of the community affects like the choreography day to day of how people like act towards each other and like move kind of like in a dance perspective sort of way.
How these movements, can you just say that last part of your question one more time?
I was saying like how the community and the space that the people live in affect their day-to-day like choreography. You talked about like an event where someone, 4 people stopped your child from running out in the street, and how could that's like a active movement, I would say.
Yep.
So kind of just like day-to-day, or how it's like elaborate more on that sort of thing.
Yeah, I see this kind of care happening every day in this community. Someone who cannot move quickly and can't make it across the street in 22 seconds, they're halfway through with a walker, with a wheelchair, and then many people moving out into traffic to stop traffic from continuing so they can keep going across the street. I also want to address the problematic of calling that choreography. It's just people moving together in space. Choreography borrows from them and not the other way around. I just want to be crystal clear that I know the difference. I see people fall down. I see people get them up. For me, what's remarkable, I've lived in Vancouver since 2006, and what has been difficult for me in the city is seeing us not see each other or violently glance and look away. And I feel like that is a conceit that doesn't move into the downtown Eastside. So that idea of like acknowledging presence, that you are here and I am here, and I live close to the former Gassy Jack corner. And there's somebody who's there every day. They're a perfectly affluent person, I can tell by their shoes. But we see each other every day and never say hello for years. And finally, I just one morning said hi, and they were completely struck and looked the other way. So I feel like that was just comedy. But I just feel like if we turn our head sideways, as Deborah Hay reminds us, to turn your fucking head, which is a technical term according to her, that you would be seeing these acts happening all the time. But if we get afraid and we put blinders on and we put our head down because we don't want to be asked for change, or we're scared of someone being dirty, that you don't get the privilege of seeing other ways to move through space. And even things like jaywalking, like sometimes jaywalking is the safer move, and I sort of do see, and that jaywalking can also be a political act, right? It's like, actually, I'm crossing now because I need to. And what would that look like if we didn't use traffic lights? We just had to pay attention to the movements of other people, So these are just, does that answer your question? Super.
I was also thinking about the about marches and processions, right? I mean, routinely on the CBC, they'll say, there's a blockage at Main and Hastings on the traffic report. And you know why that's happened, because people are just pissed. Or there's something like the Women's Memorial March, or when the pole went up on Pigeon Park. I mean, that was and those events when you're with other human beings in the space you're not supposed to be in, the road, and there's drums and there's ceremony and there's ritual and so on. I mean, that's a powerful form of collective movement.
Those are great choreographies.
There we
I
go.
mean,
Okay.
Alana and I talk about
there you go. I wasn't
because
going
those
to call
are
it
really like
choreography.
we're all going to gather here. There's instructions. We all agree.
Yeah,
The
okay,
other
nice.
things I just co-opt unethically.
Another question?
I guess this is a question mainly directed towards the former students, but with being a student here already in my first few days, I've heard this idea that people are like, it's so scary around here, the downtown east side is scary, and I like as a person, I already know that is correct, but I feel complacent if I don't quite say anything, so I'm just wondering how this panel would recommend to challenge that narrative.
Nice. Great question.
Well, I'm sure everyone else can answer as well, but I think the easiest thing to say is just that it's not that scary. It can appear scary in the media, and again, there's such huge wealth disparity, even just 5 minutes away, where it's very easy to kind of stay in your comfort zones and avoid coming into the neighborhood where it's such a lively neighborhood. As Justine was saying, like there's such a wonderful sense of community here. And it's just kind of opening yourself up to having experiences outside of maybe where you're comfortable in the city. Yeah. And you're right. It is easy to be complacent when people tell you that it's scary. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess it's kind of scary. But I think the easiest thing is just like, I feel, if you do feel comfortable, like I feel like just sharing that you are okay and you don't have to be afraid of this area. I think it can change some perspectives, especially among people who don't frequent here.
Yeah, I would say I've been followed and harassed far more in other parts of the city than in the downtown east side. I actually feel comparatively safe in the downtown east side at night because there's so many people around and everyone is genuinely looking out for one another. Like I had a guy who like just offered me to walk me to the bus stop when I was leaving a music venue. And yeah, I think I encounter these things a lot. Again, on the bus, there's always like those people who are in from the suburbs on the R5 who are like looking around on Main and Hastings and are like, oh my God, it's so bad out here. And it's like, okay. But just that if people haven't like walked the neighborhood, then I think they have a very different perspective on it. Because I think that they feel like they're going to instantly, I don't know, explode if they walk down Main and Hastings, but you're fine. And yeah, just that you can gently encourage them to spend some time in the area. Recommend some of the local businesses that are super cool and that you can find cool things at. They're slipping my mind right now, but there's a lot of awesome local ventures.
I will say though, like you should be mindful of your surroundings wherever you're walking. I feel much more terrified on the Granville Strip than I do.
Granville is
terrifying.
scary.
But yeah, like just being mindful and respectful of the people around you.
And it's safer for students if you present as a student.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
than it is there's a lot of complexities around safety in the community. So just to acknowledge that too, but just look like a student and you'll be fine.
I'm so glad that you asked this question. I think it's a very important question, and it is a very complex issue. It's something I have thought about a lot because I've been in a position where I'm a director of an organization, hiring, bringing in volunteers. There are questions of safety that come up. And when you're in that role as well, you do tend to become liability brained. You're looking at like, what are the risks? And you also end up thinking about the most extreme scenarios that almost never play out. And that's maybe the responsible thing to do. But it also starts to, I think, cloud the reality that there is the potential for harm and risk. And that, I mean, people who are using drugs who don't have access to safe supply, people who are homeless, people who are engaged in survival sex work, like that's, for myself, like it's a quite disparate reality working in the Downtown Eastside for many, many years. And I don't know, I've been told to fuck off so many times. And that, like, maybe initially I'm kind of like, oh, that's not nice. But, you know, you really begin to understand that, you know, the people around you, maybe all of their belongings are in a bag that they're carrying with them, and you've just sort of encroached on their space, which is effectively their home. Or, like, there's just, it is incredibly complex. And yeah, I wouldn't want to undermine the reality of, like, you know, there is harm. There is potential harm.
We have time for one last question, but once again, this conversation isn't over. I hope we continue this over the term and the years that your students here. So go ahead.
Hello. I had like a question about, in a relation to what we were talking about, but I'll ask the question first. In regards to like geography, infrastructure, and like kind of what everyone here was mostly talking about, place. How do you think that affects the people that live here? For example, I know a lot, I've been to some cities that are made for people, and some of the city feels made for people, but then again, there's a lot of places that don't feel that way anymore. And I think maybe they used to be, and that's just very scary to me that like things like jaywalking and things that sound so kind of like people breaking out of like the law and stuff, but or like sleeping on the street, something like that is like an act of like rebellion, when in reality the city is so, from the prices of rent to like just different things like this, how sidewalks are made, it all affects people and endangers people, where it like prefers cars and technology and advancement. So how does that like relate to your idea of place? And I guess what I'm trying to like ask is just like, you seem to know a lot about, you know, geography and people, and all of you have probably something to say, but a short answer or a long answer would be nice.
Anybody want to?
Even though it's a generic question, I realize.
There's a lot we can unpack with that. I mean, jaywalking is interesting because I think there are more jaywalking tickets in the Downtown Eastside than there are anywhere else, which isn't because there aren't more jaywalkers in the Downtown Eastside. That's because the cops use jaywalking as a means to criminalize poor people. So if you jaywalk in front of the courthouse, you're probably going to be fine. So I think we need to, you know, jaywalking is a legal category as opposed to using the street. I think that's important. And infrastructure is an interesting point. I mean, the Downtown Eastside exists only because of the people who live in the Downtown Eastside. It used to be called Skid Row. It used to be called the East End or the East Side, and it only became the Downtown Eastside as a place with that name because of community organizing. And every other neighborhood was called Kitsilano or Fairview Slopes or something, and this was just the void. And so the organizing that happened was to say, we are the Downtown East Side and we are residents of the Downtown East Side. Hence there was a group called the Downtown East Side Residents Association that was formed. So this space and where this space is actually is consequential, right? The temptation is to think of the Downtown East Side as the Main and Hastings. It's not. The Downtown East Side, when it was created, it was, the way it was understood was basically to the ocean, down to Clark Street, down to Canby. Yeah, so much larger space. And it was understood as basically the space for poor people, and for people. So there's an the place itself has been made, I think, by people in important ways. But there's a lot more we can say about that.
I think the particular area that I've spent the most time in the last 17 years is between sort of, I want to say, the railroad tracks. I don't know if people know what I'm talking about, but the railroad tracks that are just kind of this side of Clark or just west of Clark, to, I want to say like Main Street, Pryor, and then, down toward the water or whatever. And that's the first residential neighborhood in the whole city. It's where the first elementary school ever was in this whole city. It's made before there were huge cars going everywhere. There are still horse buggy doors on some of those houses. It looks really weird because some of the houses are way up high and you got to go up flights of stairs, and some houses have a moat or something where you got to go way down to get into them. And so for me, that neighborhood, there's always been more connectivity inside of that neighborhood because I think it is so old, because I think it does, there's no major road that really bisects it so much. There's a lot of storefronts that are inside of the neighborhood. Wayne's Grocery, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like built into a house or something, you know? Those kinds of places change the geography of that place, makes it so that people relate differently. Whereas if we're going to Costco, the experience is going to be a way different experience than if I go to the place that's just in the middle of my block inside of a house, like a storefront inside of a house. It changes the way that people are going to interact, how wide a street is, that kind of stuff.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us and kicking off this conversation.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Wendy Pedersen, Nick Blomley, Khari Wendell McLelland, Justine Chambers, Julia Aoki, Kathy Feng, and Samantha Walters. To find out more about the panelists' work, head to our show notes. If you'd like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donations will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement.